Dear Hans-Werner Sinn, dear Gerlinde Sinn, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to speak today to such a large and distinguished audience of academics gathered here to honor Hans-Werner Sinn. Hans-Werner Sinn has been a professor of economics for more than 30 years and president of the Ifo Institute for more than 15 years. Thankfully, I do not have to even attempt to summarize his copious academic achievements. Kai Konrad just did that in his excellent speech. He also pointed out that under Hans-Werner Sinn's stewardship, the Ifo Institute has developed into an internationally renowned research institution. But Hans-Werner Sinn is more than an outstanding academic and an exceptional manager of science. He's also an outstanding public intellectual who has shaped every major political debate over the past few decades by injecting economic arguments into it. Kurt Tucholsky once said that to have an effect on other people, you must first speak to them in their language. And Hans-Werner Sinn did exactly that. Like few other economists, he was able to make economic arguments accessible to the public. More than a dozen books, hundreds of opinion pieces, and numerous radio and television interviews are proof of this. They provide a great translation service from often model-based economics or from the often model-based economic profession to a language that the public is able to understand. In doing so, he was often polarizing, even more so trenchant, and always battlesome. But these are defining characteristics of a public intellectual. Public intellectuals argue their cases passionately. They have an attitude and not just an opinion. This is indispensable to ensure that their public statements encourage others to form their own opinions and to engage in the discourse. For Hans-Werner Sinn, interacting with the public was never an end in itself. It is one of his firmly held convictions that no policymaker can permanently ignore what he calls the law of economics, because doing so would eventually turn out to be extremely costly. He is convinced that politicians are always tempted to ignore the law of economics because taxpayers discover the true price track of policy measures only years later. Hans-Werner Sinn therefore wanted to alert the public early about when policies were inconsistent with economic principles. And I quote, "It is my duty to speak publicly about economic and fiscal policies and to initiate debates," as he put it in an interview. It is this motivation which gave rise to this enormous number of public interventions. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't give you the full list of topics he's covered. Today I will highlight just 3 issues that have been milestones over the last 25 years of Germany's economic history. And they all bear some lessons for today's economic challenges in Europe as well. The first stop on our journey through the German economic history will be Germany's economic unification. When East German companies entered into the economic, monetary, and social union with West Germany in the 90s, their productivity lagged far behind that of their Western competitors. In their book, Jumpstart, Hans-Werner Sinn and his wife Gerlinde pointed out that to avoid rising unemployment in the eastern part of Germany, wages there would have to remain below those in the western part until Eastern German companies had increased the capital stock and thus labor productivity sufficiently. But at that time, policymakers were already confronted with a strong migration movement from Eastern to Western Germany, and huge differences in wages between the two parts of Germany would have further accelerated this movement. So maintaining large discrepancy in wages wasn't their preferred option, and they accepted that labor unions and employers' associations agreed to fully adjust wages to those in the western part of Germany in as little as 5 years. The book Jumpstart correctly predicted that it would be completely impossible that productivity of the Eastern German economy could increase quickly enough to make these wages compatible with full employment or at least low unemployment. And indeed, in the first 5 years of economic unification, unemployment in Eastern Germany rose from virtually 0 to almost 17%. Unemployment in the western part increased only by 3 percentage points. But to be fair, other factors may also have contributed to the increase in unemployment. One was the currency conversion, and some of you will remember the controversial debate about how to convert the East German mark into the Deutschmark. In the end, wages in Eastern Germany were converted 1-to-1 into Deutschmark. The then president of the Bundesbank, Karl Otto Pöhl, had warned, for the same reasons, by the way, that Hans-Werner Sinn put forward, that this was to the disadvantage of companies in Eastern Germany. However, he later also acknowledged that there was hardly any alternative as political realities were stronger than economic logic. The high level of unemployment in Eastern Germany was cushioned by transfers from the western part. While the exact amount of these transfers is, of course, difficult to calculate, Hans-Werner Sinn once estimated that transfers paid up to the present day amount to around 1.8 trillion euro, roughly the size of German GDP in 1991. But this number certainly comprises not only transfers via the social security system, but is a broader concept. A central tenet of Jumpstart is that it would have been much cheaper to compensate employees for accepting lower wages than to compensate the unemployed for the job losses. Implement distributional objectives through transfers and not by altering factor prices was the economic principle that Hans-Werner Sinn saw violated in the formation of the economic union between the two Germanys. And he feared that this would allow wages to remain above the market clearing level for way too long. And also the distributional objectives were only partly achieved, by the way, not least because unemployment in Eastern Germany is still higher than in the western part. Per capita income in Eastern Germany is still only 71% of that in Western Germany. It is this experience which explains, I would add at least partly, why so many German economists are skeptical about establishing a transfer union in Europe. And at the European level, these problems are even aggravated by the fact that the balance between control and liability would be thrown further out of kilter. Decisions would mainly be taken at the national level, while the consequences of those decisions would be spread across the entire euro area. Many proposals in terms of risk sharing and mutualizing liabilities have been put forward over the past years, including Eurobonds or the establishment of a common deposit insurance scheme. But little has been said about the necessary transfer of fiscal sovereignty. Without a transfer of national fiscal powers to the European level, such a setup would undermine the incentives for sound and sustainable policy decisions in the member states. And I will come back to this point later on. Hans-Werner Sinn's impetus to explain to the public when policymakers tried to defy the basic principles of economics struck again in the early 2000s. In another round of public interventions, he warned that the German welfare state was ill-equipped to deal with the forces of globalization. Germany's reform of the labor market is the second step of our journey to the past. The key economic principle at stake was again the same. Distributional objectives should not be aimed at by changing factor prices. With regard to the entry of China and India into the global markets, Hans-Werner Sinn was convinced that this would put downward pressure on the wages of the least skilled workers in Germany. Trade in goods and mobility of capital creates a common labor market, and on such a labor market, there can no longer be substantial differences in wages, as he put it at the time. He was rightly concerned that Germany's approach of using wage substitutes to compensate the losers of globalization would define an implicit minimum wage that would prevent wages from adjusting And this was yet another attempt to defy economic forces. And as a result, globalization produces unemployment rather than gains from trade, he wrote in a very influential article in 2004. So a way had to be found to compensate the losers of globalization without preventing the market from adequately determining factor prices. Together with other economists, the German Council of Economic Experts, and also the Bundesbank at the time, he therefore called for a change in the welfare state paradigm, to rely more on wage subsidies and less on wage substitutes. This made Hans-Werner Sinn one of the trailblazers of the so-called Agenda 2010 reforms that were enacted between 2003 and 2005. A central element of the reforms was to shorten the period of eligibility for unemployment assistance and to tighten work availability requirements. In return, the government began topping up low wages, and Germany's welfare system now paid, as Hans-Werner Sinn put it, more for taking part and less for staying away. And the recipe, by the way, worked as predicted. Unemployment began to trend downwards and employment began to rise. The full truth is, however, that this was also supported by a changing behavior on the part of trade unions and employers' association, resulting in a more moderate wage policy and the strengthening of establishment-level agreements as trade unions reacted to the further increase in the already high level of unemployment. But these changes allowed Germany to rise to the multiple challenges stemming from the German unification, the competitive pressure from EU enlargement to the East, and globalization. By the way, even today, and against the background of almost full capacity utilization, the wage settlements are still mindful of their employment effects. The Bundesbank's focus, however, with regard to wages is purely analytical. The crucial question for us is here whether the development of wages is in line with our main objective, price stability. And in this regard, we have in particular to check for second-round effects. And according to our analysis, such second-round effects can currently be denied for Germany. And this perspective on wages is not a policy recommendation, not only because we do respect the autonomy in wage bargaining, but also because we agree with Hans-Werner Sinn that wage negotiations should not be overburdened by aiming other policy goals, for example, by targeting the current account. Recent policy decisions, unfortunately, such as the introduction of the minimum wage and the option to draw a full pension at 63 offered to long-term contribution payers, can, however, be seen as a rollback of the Agenda 2010 reforms. And again, these decisions illustrate the key challenge related to economic policy advice I mentioned earlier. In the short run, where the economic situation and employment is relatively stable, the minimum wage, for example, might even have a positive conjunctural effect as it leads to an increase in the income of the workforce. And consequently, the Bundesbank assumed in its own macroeconomic forecast for last year that the minimum wage would have a slight stimulating growth effect. In the medium term, the consequences of the minimum wage are certainly less benign and will first of all depend on whether a politicization of the work of the low-wage commission can be avoided, and after the most recent public statements, one can be doubtful of that. Ladies and gentlemen, the last stop on our time travel expedition is the euro area crisis, which is also one of Hans-Werner Sinn's central points of focus in his academic but also in his political work. In his book, The Euro, he writes, "The tension in Europe stems from a fundamental conflict between wish and reality, or what has been dubbed the primacy of policy over the law of economics. For years, policymakers have been able to get their own way and pretend that fiscal constraints, laws of economics, and mathematics simply do not exist." In his description of the euro area's current state, he is rather negative, I would even tend to say gloomy. He said that today the Eurozone is a shambles, staggering from one crisis to the next. And as he knows, I'm not as pessimistic as he is with regard to the state of the euro area, and this is not only because of the difference in age and the fact that as life advances, recollection takes the place of hope, to quote the German writer Wilhelm Raabe. After all, there has been some progress in the euro area countries and also in the euro area institutions. But I do agree with him that one important reason for the euro area crisis was the limited success of capital markets in constraining public and private indebtedness in the euro area member states, which found its expression in an exaggerated convergence of risk premiums for lending to governments and households in the euro area after the introduction of the euro. This convergence could be partly explained by the elimination of the exchange rate risk because of the introduction of the euro. But the convergence in risk premiums went even further as investors mispriced the risks associated with the increase in public and private debt levels. While the rescue mechanisms that were put in place prevented the crisis in the euro area from escalating, they did so by bailing out creditors to banks and sovereigns. The principle of creditor liability was further undermined. And this is another of the economic laws, violation of which Hans-Werner Sinn warned would turn out to be very costly. Creditor liability is the core tenet underpinning a market economy, he wrote. Investors only act with caution when making their investments if they reckon with being held liable in case their investment fails. Hans-Werner Sinn devoted at least 3 books to this issue, all of which contain impassioned calls to realign control and liability. An important step in this direction with regard to investments in banks was made in the beginning of this year when the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive, BRD in short, became effective. It helps to ensure that in the future the shareholders and creditors of banks will be first in line to absorb any risk and losses. And in this context, it is also important to note that because of the new Basel III regulations, banks are now obliged to maintain higher capital buffers, and this helps to increase bank shareholders' liability if the bank has to be restructured or even resolved. To ensure that the principle of liability, or as Walter Eucken put it, those who reap the benefits must also bear the costs, is also respected with regard to sovereign debt. The founding fathers of the euro had incorporated the no bailout clause in the Maastricht Treaty. It was the linchpin of the construction of the euro, as Hans-Werner Sinn wrote in one of his books. But with the institutions and rules in place before the crisis, simply letting a sovereign default proved to be risky for the financial stability in the euro area, and because governments and bonds were treated wrongly as risk-free in the capital regime for banks, they held a significant stock of government bonds, and the sovereign bank nexus, which was so fatal during the crisis, is strong in the euro area. Hans-Werner Sinn suggested a number of measures that would bring more market back into the sovereign debt market. Here I would like to mention only 2 that strike me as being particularly important and which are similar to points that I also make quite frequently. The first is to do away with the regulatory privileges afforded to public debt. The second proposal is to limit assistance from the rescue mechanism to what is absolutely necessary to assess whether the situation at hand is one of illiquidity or one of insolvency. While Hans-Werner Sinn tries to achieve this by limiting the time for assistance up to 2 years, the Bundesbank has suggested to introduce an automatic 3-year maturity extension for all government bonds, which would be activated the moment a government applies for an ESM program. This is designed not to let private bondholders off the hook until it is clear that the problem is one of illiquidity and not insolvency. Addressing both issues is crucial to enhancing the functioning of the Maastricht framework, and which is, as it has to be recalled, from time to time, still the legal foundation of our monetary union. Last but not least, Hans-Werner Sinn unquestionably deserves special acclaim for pointing the public's attention on the impact of central bank crisis measures. He anchored his criticism in the discussion of one specific keyword: the balances of the trans-European automated real-time gross settlement express transfer system, known as Target for short. He even dared to write a book about this topic, which was previously known to only a handful of experts. I'm sure no one else than Hans-Werner Sinn could have taken such an unwieldy subject and propelled it to the top of the German bestseller list for business books. I don't wish to rehash the whole Target debate here. The Bundesbank shares many of the observations made and conclusions reached by Hans-Werner Sinn. However, our opinions also do differ in several points of the analysis. For instance, we don't see the target system as a problem per se, but rather as a system that reflects existing problems in the euro area. Above all, the underlying risks stem from the provision of liquidity and the liquidity provisioning framework in the euro area. Similarly, in banking, it is the non-performance of a loan that is, or the performance of a loan that is a potential risk, not the payment system through which the payments were routed. Consequently, our critical appraisal focuses on aspects of such liquidity provision where the boundary between monetary policy and fiscal policy is in danger of becoming blurred. For example, when emergency liquidity assistance is granted on a very large scale, the collateral framework is severely watered down, or when government bonds are purchased. And this is doubtless in keeping with Hans-Werner Sinn's views, but our views probably differ in our assessment of the risks that the target system presents for Germany, say. But despite some differences in opinion, it is without any doubt one of Hans-Werner Sinn's outstanding achievements that he has fostered intense and broad public debate, even though his sometimes sharply propounded arguments did not always make life easier for us in the euro system. Dear Hans-Werner Sinn, Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, "There is no greater consolation in age than the feeling of having put the whole force of one's youth into works which still remain young." Well, I'm not sure your age necessarily warrants the need for consolation. But looking at your latest publications, you seem to have maintained a lot of this force. And you have obviously saved some of your youth for a host of other achievements above and beyond those which I've discussed today. But I hope that the short time journey I've undertaken today through your public interventions over the past decades demonstrates at least one thing quite clearly, that your achievements will not age. They contain lessons that are still relevant today and will be relevant tomorrow. And there's no doubt that your publication list will even become longer. You already said in an interview that you were planning to write more books, and for some, this may sound like a threat. I wish you the strength and energy for many more public interventions. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will find the discussions here at today's symposium inspiring, I must say, as the contributions of Hans-Werner Sinn. And this is the right time now for me to turn over to the panel. Harold, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for your attention.